So that was 3 games in one video. It was fun to do. I don't know if I'll ever end up doing another retrospective, at least not anytime soon. What's funny is my second ever review I had planned on doing was a Max Payne retrospective. I have no idea what would have came of it back then, but I went with Postal 2 instead out of familiarity, and then I just ended up never really getting around to it. It was interesting in how the first game was still the hardest to write about since, I thought it would set the pace for the rest of the video for the following 2 games. And of course each game was actually different enough that I had to make subtle shifts, or not so subtle shifts. I mean, 3 was entirely its own beast. The thing that takes the longest to write in these videos is how much I should jump between story and mechanics, and how often can I weave them together. It tends to just sort of work itself out once I hit a flow. And many times before I find that flow, I hate my own style and think I should just drop all the story at once and then move on to mechanics, as I did in Dying Light. It even happens in games with minimal stories such as Pac-Man World 1 and 2, since I feel those small bits of cutscene are still story enough. It's just a bit easier since I can do, this starts at the beginning and this goes at the end, because those are more like motivation and payoff than a story. And they're both fine motivation and payoff. So, the Pac-Man World series. A very interesting series that I found a fair bit to talk about with each game. And one last thing before we get into this proper, to those watching who don't know, there is now a Patreon Discord set up which you should be able to access on the Patreon page, which will make it far easier to get Afterthought questions to me, and we can have a bit more back and forth, we can shoot the shit. So that's available on the Patreon page. If you wish to, please come on in. As for the series, I had fun with it overall. 2 was my overall favourite, but I think each game had some individual strengths of their own. 1 had the best music and most inventive stage concepts overall. I think part of that goes with the series trying to find its feet in a way Pac-Man World 2 felt more comfortable. So in Pac-Man World 1 we have, travelling back in time, platforming through pirate docks, going off into space, big factories, and then a big spooky graveyard. And that gives a lot of room for different music, and near enough every stage had its own music. Nice music goes a long way for me in a platformer. For what it's worth, this is also the most challenging entry in the series. However, whether or not I'd call that a good thing or a good challenge varies wildly from level to level. It may have been because the last time I played a platformer on the PlayStation 1 I was a kid, but I was really worried going back to play one. I thought the platformers of that era were obnoxiously hard, but then most of my PlayStation 1 platforming was that Mickey Mouse game and Crash Bandicoot 1, which are both hard games for various reasons. And I wasn't entirely wrong. One stage was rather unfair. However, the rest of the game's difficulty is far from egregious. Pac-Man World 2 had the strongest platforming. This game felt like a tune-up in all of the right ways. Keep what was good, retool or toss away the rest. Its challenge is far more consistent, save for the camera, which was bugging out, but I never had the same issues of unfairness creeping up in my mind. I do think that World 2 had the weakest world concept, however, it's far less imaginative than World 1. Grass, snow, fire, water, dirty water. It made each stage far more enjoyable, but far more safe levels out of them. And it's strange, I do stand by this series being at its best when it's simply giving me fun platforming challenges to navigate, making tight jumps and such. But Ice Mountain is my favourite world overall, even though it's 3 spins on the core concept. An uphill struggle that's not terribly dangerous, an avalanche, and an ice skating level. And then World 3 had the strongest dialogue. And that might seem like an unfair point because it didn't really have competition. I think it is actually a fair point because at first I was against there being this much dialogue on principle. It had to fight to get me on board from a weak starting position. So it having the strongest dialogue is a fair point because the previous games got on fine with very little of it. I can't overstate how odd it is to have Pac-Man suddenly being very talkative. Knowing this was originally not Pac-Man World 3 made it a far more understandable change in retrospect, but it still sits weirdly. His personality lines up with the ever-smiling, merciless destroyer of worlds he is, while, still being likeable. I think it had the potential to be a genuinely fun game, but I think a lot of it needed to be sped up. Make enemies far more aggressive and deadly, but possessing far less health, that kind of thing. I generally think the longer a health bar gets, the more complex you need to make your fighting. More options and such. I think it's a terrible combat system, and I'm glad that it's easy, because you don't have the defensive options for it to be challenging. No blocks or dodges besides movement. Being a mash fest with enemies that possess a ton of health is not fun for gameplay, it just slows everything down. It makes me resent enemies being there. And how is it that I always end up talking about Pac-Man World 3 the most? Let's move on to questions because a fair bit of what I might have said beforehand comes up in questions. DBZ King 119. 1. I find it incredibly jarring that the third game had such bizarre focus on plot. Did it come across as odd to you when you played it? Yeah, but I quickly adapted. I tend to try and take each game on its own merits nowadays, and it didn't take long to realise that talkies were going to be common. Getting to like it was the bigger issue, and even then that was done within what turns out to be about 3 stages. That's when the cutscene came that kind of turned me around on it, so it was very early on in the game. I'd also had some not-so-subtle hints, and an inclination that there was more behind that title that tipped me off a bit. What kind of happened there was, a friend told me there was some strange things about it to play it, and then he would fill me in on what was really going on, and see if my opinion changed much, and context does change a game sometimes, but it can't change the amount of fun you were having at the time. To some extent, all that really matters is the end result when you're playing the game. But I also can't say that while playing it I was out and out bored with the story at any point. I can say with the benefit of having beaten it, I wish it had a bit more meat on its bones, because it feels like there should be, with how often Owen and the Ancients get brought up but don't really have anything too much to them. Not to mention the side cast of characters met, you know, the engineer of an abandoned town, a janitor in Owen's giant fortress, and the one remaining archaeologist. What's funny is these individuals all come from what should be group settings. These aren't wandering nomads. Owen only had one janitor. I mean, he was a damn fine janitor. The place was spick and span before Pac-Man came in, and it's fucking huge. Question 2. What would Pac-Man slasher name villain be? The Ghost Gobbler, Power Pellet Pulverizer, Circle of Life and Death, the Dot Executor, the Waka Waka Knocker, Yellow Death, Yellow Fever, and of course just plain old Pac-Man. The name inspires fear alone. He is a slasher villain. Question 3. Have you ever played Pac-Man Adventures in time for the PC? I feel like you would really enjoy it. That I have not. I've watched a bit of gameplay and it all seems to be themed mazes, so that's not for me. Like I said, I enjoy maze gameplay in short bursts, and they worked well in the World Series because, you know, they were part of platforming stages, and as such, you know, I did them in short bursts, and that worked out quite well for me. I did appreciate this from the opening cutscene though. I'd be up and ready to go if I heard that. There is one more question which I've merged with another and will answer at the end of this video. Eric, question 1. Which do you think you would prefer? An ideal version of Pac-Man World 3, i.e. the same tone and concepts and design philosophy, but with much better combat, better design in general, a more in-depth story, etc., or a fully realised Pac-Man Adventures? I'm saying this with the benefit of having played 1. I would have probably liked to have seen a full-fledged Pac-Man Adventures, but there's little to go off on what it could have been, you know, gameplay-wise, so this might be one of those better the devil you know type situations. Beyond an action RPG with some really strange locales and fun character designs and a darker plot to go along with it, it's hard to say how different it would have actually been. An action RPG necessitates a greater focus on combat, which I disliked, but it may have been more fleshed out there, might have had more systems, characters, perhaps even usable items and leveling. It might not have even been real-time combat. What if this action RPG thing was actually more turn-based, or we don't even know. It might have been cooldown-based. That would have been a hell of a thing. And hell, it might not have had any platforming whatsoever. I think World 3 did at least prove that I can take a story with Pac-Man in any way seriously and enjoy it. And give him dialogue which works. I do think an ideal Pac-Man World 3 would be nice to have, however, but I don't know what would really change. I mean, I found Pac-Man's moveset sensible but strange throughout the games. He has a rev roll which plays into his ball shape and a bounce attack. I get they're convenient, but with Pac-Man World 3 having a combat focus, I'm a little disappointed his third attack was punching, even if he's always had the gloves for it. I don't know, if this game had combos or extra moves, it'd be nice to see him munching down, being thrown in as an attack, perhaps eating enemies to seal their powers. I mean, he's already taken a move from Sonic, what's one from Kirby? Question 2, on a similar note. If all 3 games in the series were at their ideal state, so like in 2, take out Water World, other minor flaws, stronger finishing bosses, using elements like shrinking and swimming and skating more, do you think a fully realised 2 would still be your favourite, or would that change things? I think it would remain my favourite game, because I think just conceptually it did what I wanted it to do the most. I think I'd still find Pac-Man World 1 less enjoyable for structural reasons. I think an ideal Pac-Man World 1 would still task you with getting keys, though maybe a bit better about letting you know when a key is present, making it less of a crapshoot. I think one improvement in an ideal state would be analog movement and greater physics on Pac-Man, which would at least make the platforming more enjoyable overall, so I can't complain there. But I feel an ideal Pac-Man World 1 would actually be a bit more obfuscated, and I can't quite put my finger on why. It's just that game felt a bit like a treasure hunt at times, like it wanted to be a treasure hunt. And I think that backtracking was the kind of replacement because the camera didn't allow for it, though I might be going off on a bit there. I might be speculating a bit too hard. I'm not sure if I'd be too into an ideal Pac-Man World 3 as much as I would be for the other two still. Its ideal form is something I'm less into, a more slow-paced brawler of a platformer. What I'm left wondering is if it had been really good on its own merits, would that have pleased everyone who really enjoyed 2 regardless? The games have fundamentally different aims. 2 was short, sweet, and safe. It would have been nice to see the shrink pellet put in some actual gameplay somewhere. It surely had to have been planned to. I mean, why would it just exist to get you through an end-of-stage hole and through a caved-in doorway, when both of these things surely must have taken more effort to make into little holes than just be open doorways? I'm unsure if I'd want Waterworld to be removed. I mean, if it were actual levels, that could be fun. Or it could be worse. Water stages tend to be drags, even when they're good. Question 4. Did you find any of the games felt too short or too long? Despite my gripes of Waterworld, I think 2 was a good length. Didn't outstay its welcome, clearly had more content, skill challenges and such, and if I wanted I can sink my teeth into those and master what was there. I didn't 100% it, so I haven't seen its full breadth of content, in some fashion. Played all the levels, but didn't get everything in them. 1 and 3 I think both fell on the side of a bit too long, but I don't consider that a terrible negative. 1 was due to backtracking that I took upon myself, and 3 just had a little bit too much early game plotting and just some areas that were overly large and, the fights mainly just dragged it out a bit. What's funny is maybe actually giving more depth to either Owen or the Ancients would have put a band-aid on this problem by giving me a bit more to think about on my way through the game. So the solution there would have been actually just more dialogue, essentially, or more fleshed out, more in-depth dialogue. Arm and ready. Question 1. If all 3 of these Pac-Man games were re-released with improved gameplay, what would you suggest to improve on each game you played? Be as specific or as vague as you like. Pac-Man World 1, I would likely tie keys and family members to either optional challenges outside of key hunting, give them over to the boss, or signpost the keys in stages a bit more so that you know what you're going after. I'd pull the camera out a bit more and angle it downwards to give greater depth, and perhaps make Pac-Man's drop shadow a bit more pronounced to make some platforming challenges a bit easier. And of course, everything I mentioned in previous things about tightening up his physics, giving him true analog movement, all that stuff. Pac-Man World 2, the only obvious big flaw I can think of is fixing the camera. And while this is more than just improved gameplay, replacing those 2 repeat boss fights with something other would be nice. Pac-Man World 3, I've kind of already said, faster combat, maybe cut down a little bit on some stages, maybe put a greater focus on platforming challenges over enemy combat, because the enemy combat felt like padding. I've already kind of said what I feel would improve Pac-Man World 3, but I think it would take a lot for me to think it a really, really good game, rather than just interesting. Question 2. Sonic Forces review. When can we expect to see it? I will only say this month, hopefully. I've got all my footage, I've got the beginning of a script, I've got 2 whole pages of me talking about the entire mainline Sonic series that I don't know if I'll split into a different video, and a big bundle of notes. My main issue, as always, is working out how I want to organise talk about the story with the gameplay, but that won't be too difficult. Once I figure out a flow, it will go easy. Question 3. As for the Yakuza review, what can we expect from people who have never played the series? Myself included, though I've been wanting to. For Yakuza 1, expect a bad dub, awkward fighting mechanics, and the series having not really found its stride yet. Story's still good though. I've only played through Yakuza 1 once, and have not returned to it since, so maybe second time will make a difference. But there's a reason I haven't returned to it. What to expect series-wide, however, a big cast of lovable characters, led by Kazuma Kiryu, aka Japanese Crime Jesus, crime melodrama, hilarious side quests, a big heaping of virtual tourism, Japanese parlor games, hostess clubs, onsens, people becoming dramatically stupid around guns, some sick-ass fighting moves, a whole slew of minigames, and once we make it to Yakuza 4, the biggest, dumbest twist in any piece of media. Honestly, it's a fantastic series. I'm always on the edge of my seat when the next one comes up. I am heavily awaiting 6. I'm not going to import it like I did with Yakuza 5, because this one, there's actually hope of it coming out. They promised it. Question 4. What were you expecting before going into the Pac-Man 3D games anyways? I can't really answer this one fairly. I knew they were a series of platformers before playing them, and a decent bit about Pac-Man World 2 before I started. Nothing too in-depth. I didn't expect such a focus on collectibles, and I didn't expect the personality of the characters. That was a genuine nice surprise. Pac-Man World 1 I knew basically nothing about. I could only really guess from what I knew about Pac-Man World 2. I knew from the get-go Pac-Man World 3 was different, but not the extent of it. Like, a fair bit ago, a friend had sent me some music from the game, so I knew its tone was different, and that's really pretty much it. I also knew about the robot, but not how little it appeared. I was genuinely surprised when I had seen some art of the Spectral Fiend, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a major character. Kind of. Not really. Not as much as I'd wanted. Now, on to the merged questions. Eric and DBZ King 119. If they made a Pac-Man World 4, what would you want it to be like? If suddenly Pac-Man World 4 were to happen, and were the series to continue further still, what direction would you want it to go in? How would you like it to be handled? I'd want it to basically follow on more from 2 than 3, taking the more gimmicky worlds of 1, and maybe keeping some of the characterization from 3. Keep a good level of dialogue, maybe small cutscenes after some stages, but I could go with a story as light as 1 or 2. Keep the rev roll and maybe the butt bounce. Return the butt bounce to either Pac-Man World 2 or 1 standing. It's for opening crates and maybe some platforming. It can be spammed indefinitely. The rev roll I'd keep as it operated in 3. 3D Sonic has given up on the spin dash, so, you know, let's have Pac-Man steal it. It carries momentum when you jump. I didn't talk about it, but there was some wall rolling in 3. It rarely came up, but, you know, that feature could do with some expansion. Besides that, I'd want collectibles to be there, but about as optional as they were in 2, and handled the same way, an optional challenge on top of a stage. I'd want time trial options to be open after you beat a stage, and I'd want mazes to take elements from 1, 3, and Mania. Add the ability to jump as he did in that game. Have stage hazards and stage themes present instead of the retro aesthetic, but also have power-ups and such. I would not tie them to progression as they did in 3, they would be optional like they were in 2. You get them via a Galaxian, and you can get more points for extra lives and such through them. I'd want them to essentially refine on the platforming they'd built up in 2. I think some platforming lessons can be taken from 3. I didn't mind the bigger areas that you have to search around in their entirety, however I'd also want those to go alongside plentiful, tight challenges. It's more that I'd want the focus on combat between them, you know, taken away. That's it for the World Series. I may come back to revisit the kart racer at some point and maybe check out Maze Madness, though if I do I'll look into Adventures of Time alongside it. Next up, thanks to precursors being busted, I am shifting gears to Sonic Forces as you no doubt heard in that earlier question. I hope you'll join me then.